Picture an arcade at the turn between the 80s and the 90s for me. Maybe you're thinking of something like this if you're thinking from Street Fighter and onwards, though that would be exclusively focusing on the 90s side of the hypothetical. Maybe you're picturing something like this, blurring a collection of gaming's early hitters that would eventually be phased out. In reality, you should be thinking of this. Driving games were a huge, constant part of arcade culture, particularly useful in showing off the graphical capability of the hardware and dazzling the unknowing drink drivers of the future and drawing in their spare change. Beyond the spectacle, however, was genuine joy to be had. Outrun is a classic, Hang On goes foolish even if it is advertising cigarettes to children. Power Drift maybe doesn't hit the marks that it should, and Racing Beat is 5 minutes I feel insulted for playing in an emulator, let alone the spiral that it would have sent me into if I had spent money on the machine. While you as the Grand Redditor might not think too hard on it, driving was pretty foundational in the establishment of games finding its footing, between fad and fever of the cultural variety. I'd argue it was just as important as that guy. I'm sure I don't need to mention the bizarro fever this lad was generating as he kept home consoles pumping upward, along with Duck Hunt or Rob or whatever. While his compadres might have been the ones getting consoles into the home, it was Mario that kept the console market thriving. His debut release was relevant from launch until even today. Being just a humble character in a platformer, there's not a lot you can do with him as a 16x16 sprite. But as a franchise, as an influencer, if you will, he's a digital Superman of tiny Italian proportions. But what if you combined these two? In a completely nonsensical fusion, in 1992 we saw the collision of these 2 points of gaming, unknowingly spawning a new subgenre starting with Super Mario Kart. And it wasn't very good. Aging with all the grace of Drake Bell, it can be a rough ride going back to it from the present day, though at the time it reviewed exceptionally well. Words like fun, and fun were used by magazines in desperate need of a thesaurus. In essence though, they were on the money. Super Mario Kart's colourful scenery and energetic yet unintimidating soundtrack set it up to be an inviting play space. In spite of that, and the items that could assist in keeping players in a frequently shifting pack, this game was surprisingly unwieldy. Unlike the earlier released F-Zero with its extremely sharp handling, Super Mario Kart leans more towards contemporary driving models. Attempting to accelerate through corners will have you carry that inertia, producing a wide angle, and holding that for too long causes your character to spin out. This encourages you to control your speed, not necessarily with the precision of even Gran Turismo Bumper Cars Edition, but it's trying to gentle parent you into laying off the accelerator. Cautious driving is rewarding driving, since the driving model heavily punishes overconfidence, be that through riding off the track to butcher your speed or spinning out. It's dressed up like a toy for kids, but it feels more like a wood saw painted pretty colors, the exterior attempting to hide something that's pretty painful when it inevitably goes wrong. The tracks will also make sure you come out bad and bruised, with the more inventive tracks set up more like obstacle courses inspired by the Nürburgring rather than actual places to drive, or brutalism for the wheels that provides razor-sharp corners that are aggravating to drive around, or often into. That said, it captured the heart of many a toddler who hadn't yet grown their khaki shorts and Triforce t-shirt. Aside from reviewing well, it also pushed its way to the 4th highest selling game on the SNES at just under 9 million copies, though the reliability of those figures seems questionable. The important thing is that it helped to solidify Mario as a franchise. It's easy to forget now, but with Nintendo's approach as games as toys, they stood out in how they used a grown man as a vehicle for kids to attach themselves to, which wasn't always a good idea, but hey ho. They already had the sequels, the shows, the merch, and this was another step towards making Mario, the brand, disconnected from Mario, the running man, proving that you could put the same recognizable face over the top of a completely different product and push it to a wider audience. F-Zero puts Mario Kart to shame, and yet one of them has gone places, while the other languishes in the clutches of 99's locker. So when the next console dropped, it was time for a repeat, one that was much, much better. Once again, it reviewed great, fun. When was the thesaurus invented, actually? Unlike Super though, this game still holds up decently well. Super Mario Kart plays more like an attractive novelty. At the time, I'm sure it was exceptional, but since then it's been outclassed to the point of irrelevance. 64 is certainly approaching that threshold, but for now it's still an interesting game, even without the view as a point of history. Taking corners now doesn't have to be a cautious crawl thanks to revamped drifting. It's a game that's fully content to let the player hold down the accelerator and max out its speed. speed. Vehicles have substantially more traction. When you turn, you still carry some of the momentum in the opposite direction to the turn, but it's subtle. Wide turns are always trivial regardless of handling model, but the sharper cornering that the game is so eager to implement is less demanding at the outset. You still carry speed, but the momentum is more in the hands of the player, rather than a constant of the physics. It's something that seems small, but helps to reframe how the game flows, and you could even consider this what makes the kart racer and anti-gravity racer genre distinct from Sims and certain Simcade titles. Even all the way back then, titles that lean towards a realistic handling model of slow acceleration and heavy inertia, made for games where turning emphasizes your actions before the corner that impacts the result after and during. That might not be the most realized on the PlayStation 1, but by the PlayStation 2, where the consequence of failure was a collision system that properly punished inconsiderate driving, you could tell there was a more deliberate nature to its play. To boil it down in a way that will get a tuna foaming at the mouth, games leaning towards Sims are about planning each turn thanks to the compounding nature of actions. Because drifting and turning allow for much more immediate alteration of your trajectory in 64 and what would go on to be other kart racing games, it's both consistently more forgiving from its perspective of feel, but also much more reactive from the perspective of decision making. Hugging the inside line in 64 feels great because of all the small adjustments that you're making on the fly, while more conventional racing games develop more of its satisfaction through all of the pieces that you had to align prior to a turn to bring that hug all together. 64's biggest flaw in this regard is that it doesn't seem to know how it wants to commit to this appeal. The handling model is more responsive, which makes sharper, substantial turns more enjoyable to traverse, like in Wario's Circuit, but isn't responsive enough to make little adjustments and narrow pathways anything more than a headache. This turn in Bowser's Castle springs to mind immediately. It seems more like the level design of something in Doom rather than a racing game, and because of the tight nature of the corridor, you're having to plan your approach from the entrance of the room prior while avoiding the thwomps. It's a quirk of this level, and as a novelty isn't that bad, but it can be a little bit frustrating, which unfortunately is a pretty common theme within its levels. Calamari Desert features particularly narrow roads on wide turns, making drifting feel a little bit cumbersome. Not to jump the gun, but when this was put in a later game, I didn't hate this specific challenge, but the way the handling model punishes you when you're holding outwards on a drift for too long by forcing the car inward turned what should feel like varying degrees of precision into varying degrees of precarious. Alternatively, Toad's Turnpike and Frappe Snowland offer challenges that place objects directly in the path of the player. The handling model offers a lot of alterations when drifting and responding to second-long interactions, which is why on Toad's Turnpike this sometimes isn't an issue, but it isn't snappy enough on non-drift turns to make split-second alterations that these sections can sometimes require. You carry just a little bit too much momentum to make these kind of smaller corrections within a reasonable time. These sections of the course are trivial if you came in at the correct angle, but it's a mess otherwise. Emphasized on Frappe Snowland thanks to the draw distance on sprites making it hard to tell if you're coming in at an angle that doesn't need to be altered. Rainbow Road is far too long and dull to be repeated as a 3-lap track, and Banshee Boardwalk can fuck off. I'd be lying if I knew why. I just don't like it. All this is a little harsh for a game that's ultimately pretty good. If every video game burst into flames tomorrow and I was only left with Mario Kart 64, I'd probably be pretty happy. But it's because of what it spawned that makes its successes so hard to see. After Mario Kart 64 sold, supposedly, 9 million copies to make roughly a third of all 64 owners with a copy in their collection, other companies started to draw inspiration from Mario's franchise. This was during the era of mascots for consoles, where franchises were a vehicle to latch yourself onto and buy all of the product that you can. The gamer's second favorite pastime is to wonder who's ruining the game industry and why, so even though this might be appealing to a very specific type of skeptic moron, I think it's pretty clear to see that the games that were following in Mario's tire prints weren't exactly doing it in good faith. Chocobo Racing might be a decent game, but it's not bursting with creativity, it's copying a formula, just a little bit more effectively than some of its competition. When Sonic drunkenly stumbled home at 6 AM to cook up Sonic R, it wasn't out of passion, it was to play catch up with the trendsetter. It doesn't matter how much you're impressed with your drunk cooking on the night, you fucking moron, I'd still rather eat Lego. Let's not poison ourselves with the macroplastics here though. Sure, some of the ideas are okay, but it sure is Lego handling, and that doesn't qualify for quality no matter how rose-tinted the bricks are. Still, I'd much rather take this over Muppet Race Mania. I've been told that Jim Henson was a pretty nice guy, so I'm assuming this is a surrogate for all the sin in his life. It's not the worst game I've ever played, though it's certainly pushing it, but the potentially silly-ass physics could be clumsy entertainment if not let down by a camera that's as distant as the parents that brought this for their kids. You're far enough away that you're given very little context of what you're landing on and what will be coming. If this was a simple racing game, it would act as some mediocre shovelware, but the variety on display here brings the quality of the experience down. Novelty is good within an established core. Here, the constantly changing game modes, which almost nothing feels accommodated for, makes for a game that's constantly shifting the experience right as you're getting the hang of what it wants from you. If every game on the planet folded its prions except for Muppet Race Mania, I'd be sad for the games we lost and stow away my love for Pro Skater like a widower. That is to say, this piece of shit wouldn't even make the cut as a memento. These games that seek to ape Mario Kart can't bring enough new concepts to be remembered outside of niche video essays. So much so that they're being outshined by the ape. Diddy Kong Racing isn't exactly true blue in its commitment to karts, but you can clearly see the same vein. Item boxes, mascot characters, and a bunch of fucking scrimblos. A handling model that never tells you to take your foot off of the pedal. Even if you're in a plane, you're one of the boys in my book, not in a transphobic way though. For all its derivative elements, and believe me, they're definitely there, what helps this game stand out is its structure. Mario Kart 64 might be more interesting to play thanks to its more interesting track layouts and boosting and drifting being both more intuitive and engaging, but Diddy Kong Racing stews its subpar mechanics inside a more intentionally crafted experience for the lone player. You're given an overworld that asks you to navigate it with the same mechanics that you're playing under, with tracks gated off depending on how many tracks you've completed beforehand. Areas are concluded with a boss that doesn't fully recontextualize the mechanic, but puts them in a fresh perspective. To progress through the game feels adjacent to progressing through a world. It's that immersion buzzword. The difference between unlocking a new character in LEGO Racing and unlocking a new track in Diddy Kong is separated only by presentation. LEGO Racing requires you to win a race to access a new part of a menu. It's direct from outcome to reward. Diddy Kong Racing arbitrates this process by asking you to collect balloons, which are gained by winning races on tracks that haven't already had their balloons collected, to unlock doors, which provides you access to a new track. This might seem like a negative, though you should consider what the value really is and whether or not it's something that you don't like on paper versus something that you like in practice. This separation assists in tearing down the fourth wall as the player creates more elaborate goals, even if those steps are directly connected to one another, engaging more with the rules of the designer rather than the instructions of the programmer. It's a shame then that all of this structural goodness is let down by what I would consider a pretty lackluster game. I know I'm mad at the children's toy for being boring to play with, but as pedantic as that might be, it's how I feel. Aside from not having mini turbos, the items being so predictable are an interesting idea, but incredibly flawed. Part of the excitement of an item box is that mystery, the hope that it will provide you with something that you need, and the improvisation that occurs when it inevitably doesn't. Diddy Kong Racing attempts to offset this by letting you bank the same item over and over to make an improved version of it, but that just doesn't have that much weight to it. In such a mundane system, from the perspective of control, it produces an item system that's too predictable to be engaging from the front to the back of the pack. With randomized items, you can use that to your advantage to dynamically shift who's likely to get what items based on position, allowing players who are behind to feel like they might be able to get ahead with a strong item, and encouraging players who are ahead to permanently play on their best to ensure that if they're on the receiving end of said item, it's not too strong of a setback. When the items are fixed, you run into a more static game plan. You have the items that you like, and you stick with them without the game giving you a reason to give up on a style of play that is making you bored. It's leaps and bounds beyond the shovelware, but I'm not exactly impressed. Really, you'd have to mix the structure in with the more interesting aspects that Mario Kart brings to the table. Then you'd have a game that I'd argue is perfect.
Fasten your seatbelts for another Naughty Dog creation.
Crash Team Racing is perfect. If I had a gun to my head and was forced to make a top 5 games of the generation that birthed 3D, which is weird because you don't have to do that, just make it anyway, it'd go a little something like this. The trifecta of a genre I desperately want to see continued without fucking combat mechanics. These games are all alright, the inclusion of combat mechanics distract from the potential of what is essentially a combat-oriented platform that Tony Hawk Pro Skater never fully capitalized on. In earlier games it's lacking mechanically, and in later entries it's level of mission design. Mario 64, or Tekken 3, or maybe Symphony of the Night, I've never finished it, and Wumpa Addict cars.
What are you got in there? It's a bit of crack. Crack?
Perhaps that's egregious, there's classics on classics in this generation, but I'm being completely genuine when I say Majora's Mask and Final Fantasy VII can get to fuck. There's plenty of games you can go back to and have the magic peel away from as time has passed. The CTR has gone foolish every time I'm ready for it to crumble into a misremembered cash grab. I've got no doubt that it's a game made with the same capitalist lust that gave The Inbetweeners an American spin-off, but for what it is, it's every concept that other games had effectively perfected, and still has some ideas that have never been replicated. It's tight and snappy, unlike the games that are too loose, making them cumbersome, or so linear that it's devoid of challenge, structured in a way that makes the lonely gamer's experience whole, all while bringing new ideas to the formula that makes you feel like you're able to put your foot through the floor and break the sound barrier. Take for example its accumulative boost. While drifting, you're building up a meter on one trigger while spending it with the other. If you're in the red, that means that you're ready to spend the bar, but just because you can doesn't mean you're getting the most out of it. If you wait until your bar is just before the point where the boost becomes valueless, you get a larger increase in speed for a longer duration. You get 3 boosts together in a power slide, so each drift becomes a little micro game of how you can extend your time in it as long as possible to maximize the amount of boost that you get out of the bar. It doesn't make turning complicated, but it does make it more involving, and you're rewarded heavily for mastering it. What the game never tells you directly is that each individual boost isn't an isolated maneuver. You're constantly building towards a secret counter that you're contributing to and retracting from every time you cash out a drift. If you max out the meter and activate a boost, and then activate another boost while the previous is still active, you aren't cutting into the first one with the start of a new action, you're building on the previous action's duration. The game does provide you a subtle hint in the form of the flames on your exhaust. The bigger they are, the bigger your banked boost, but it's something that you end up intuiting as the game goes on. The result of that is being encouraged not only to always max out your drifts, but also find as many opportunities to boost as possible. Whether that be the usual, to build up the boost that you've already got, or the slightly more interesting, maintaining it through a straight to not let it decay. Getting a speed boost scratches or whatever primal chimp is still inside of us, but the ability to turn boosting into a combo that results in accumulated success plays towards our more sophisticated inner orangutan. It doesn't turn the game into high art or anything, but the highs of playing well in Crash Team Racing are much higher than anything that you could find at the time, and I'd argue are still higher than most of what you can find today. It's the most substantial contribution to the game, and it doesn't stop there. You can tell that it's not a game that threw in a cool idea and lucked out. There's small changes all over the place to make the experience fit within the genre's more central premise of reactive gameplay. Like when you jump, whether it be from a hop or a ramp, you're not locked into the current position, you're turning in the air, not just modifying the angle that you're facing, but also the position your center of mass will be. It doesn't remove all commitment, but it helps the game throw situations at you with less anticipation, so a tight corridor that springs up on you immediately doesn't have to be planned for the room before. This idea of providing more and more room to react gets touched on in every element of the handling model. Coming out of a drift doesn't send you lurching in the direction that you were facing, it pushes you in the direction that you were going as you left the turn. That might sound like an immediately good thing, but it's tricky where it helps and where it hurts. On a straight, that means you're able to keep your position without fear of careening into a wall, but on a rapid set of turns, it means you can't rely on the game to carry your momentum into the next one comfortably. This then feeds back into the drifting system. You're afforded more opportunities to get successful boosts off because you've got more control over the angles that provide those opportunities. These changes help to elevate the boost system, which by extension provides a different sense of satisfaction over its contemporaries. You never sit on one or two exciting moments, you're in a constant balancing act that could be a sustained thrill becoming a wumper withdrawal at any moment. That might not seem substantial, but it creates a very different appeal that can be felt very heavily through its tracks. Mario Circuit's a boring stage because its bare bones nature doesn't complement the simple driving mechanics. It's designed as a beginner's environment, intentionally stripped back to not distract from learning about the items and basic controls. It serves a purpose, but it doesn't highlight a quality. Coco Park is similarly simple, wide lanes that let the fundamentals be taught to the player, but the same lack of novelty that creates an enjoyable learning space will emphasize the importance of maxing out a boost once you've become a self-described expert. Engine Labs is a boxy layout done to perfection, pacing out its tight turns to make 90-degree walls more than just hairpins and straightaways. Polar Pass, goated. Speedway Sewer, iconic. Hapu's, Pyramid! Dragon Mines is a bit shit, but hey, someone had to be the runt of the litter. When the levels aren't being excellent playgrounds that let you explore the mechanics, they're clever invitations to let the player really push those mechanics limits. Take this wall in Polar Pass. It divides the straight from the rest of the track, requiring you to take this hairpin. But because the wall is fairly shallow, you can go straight over it with a well-timed jump. And thanks to the control that you have in the air, you don't have to thread the needle on the setup to make sure that you come out of the right angle if you hit it. The game actually does that a ton. Shortcuts that ask you not if you have the right item, though the game isn't safe from that either, but just if you're man enough to hit it, and punishing you heavily if you take the chance but fuck it up. My personal favorite track has to be Blizzard Bluff, in part for that reason. It's got back-to-back skips, one very obviously intended and the other that's got shades of Shrine of Storms, with both of them having dire consequences for failure. This one in Polar Pass is definitely not intended. I feel gross doing this. But it's nice that the game is willing to let you break it in this way. Crash Team Racing looked at everything the genre could be and solved it like a science. And if you look into it, players then broke that science and it's still great. It's hard to limit its praise to even good or great for a kart racer. If you've got any interest in surprisingly intricate movement systems or mechanically accumulative games, then give it a shot. Obviously, if you like Mario Kart, this is a must-play, but the same could be said if you like platformers like Dust Force, or games that unexpectedly changed my life forever. There's a very specific brain worm that I have, and I'd imagine you have it too. It's a part of me that needs a game to not only be brought to its fullest when you've achieved perfection, but also needs that same game to be a giggle curator prior to that point. And Crash Team Racing is that game. Despite its efforts though, Crash Team Racing was chasing after Mario Kart, and while there was a lot of time between the two games, it's telling that it wasn't even able to take second in the lineup of total sales. 4 million certainly isn't bad, and it's remembered well enough to not be a hidden gem, but these are the sales figures of something that feels more like the B-sides of a console's discography. It outsold Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, but I mean, that's besides the point. It got its foot in the door at the right time for a mascot to have a lot of persuasion in buying a game, and it was adamantly the best at its craft, though releasing in 1999, it was a product without much time left in the console's limelight. A new generation, once again, meant new games, but this new generation never seemed to strike the right chord. While Nintendo was still refining the quality of their formula with Double Dash, which would eventually end up obliterated in quality by DS, the new millennium brought a lot less refinement to the formula than you might have expected. Mario Kart DS was a fantastic sequel to its console counterpart, featuring mission modes and retro tracks, and it's just so good. But it was an exception to the norm from the perspective not only of quality, but also success. Crash Nitro Kart seems like a continuation of where the previous game left off. The tracks are still inventive and colourful, and it further encourages chaining boosts together with a direct combo counter. So it's surprising to me that there's an almost indescribable something that's missing that doesn't let it shine like its predecessor. While you could debate whether or not it's a kart racer, Jak X is a somewhat interesting blend of the arcade racer of Burnout melded with the ideas of Mario Kart and Twisted Metal, a mix of genres that leads to mixed results. It never struck a chord with me personally. People remember this game fondly, but in my mind it sits between too many different racing genres at once, making for a game that's likable, but not exactly lovable. Skipping ahead in time, there's a lot to like about Mod Nation, particularly its sense of speed and the idea of stacking items to make them more powerful, much like LEGO Racers. While it strikes all the right emotional tones of thrills and adrenaline, it doesn't manage to catch that sense of depth that Crash Team Racing or Mario Kart DS found. Thankfully, the team would go on to take this as the base for Little Big Planet karting. Even if that meant that Sackboy didn't get an exceptional adventure, he'd still have something that was pretty good. I'd level a similar critique at Sonic All-Stars Racing. Its phenomenal presentation would have you thinking that Sega has ever produced games that are above an 8 out of 10, though the bland gameplay has that slide right back into the usual rating. That's kind of what we loved about Sega though. They were the guys making pretty good weird shit for a long time. What do you fucking mean Crazy Taxi is being turned into an MMO? Remember though that this was a corporate endeavor. The developers almost certainly tried their hardest, but what mattered to the company was the sales. And while companies were mostly mostly rewarded for their efforts, I doubt it was meeting expectations. Mario Kart DS was repeating success, but those around it weren't seeing the same explosive returns. Sonic seems to have struck a decent note, but it also seems to have been more appreciated as time goes on, especially with its continued availability on Steam over other games at the time. Mod Nation and Nitro Kart managed to break the million mark, certainly good, but the games that followed them struggled to inspire confidence, and alongside the only meager success of Jak X would all never see a follow-up. Their inconsistent achievements that some might consider failures if you're managing the company budget weren't exactly surprising considering the direction the games were heading. The kart racer, as a genre, was being driven by brand recognition, and when it wasn't being upheld by a franchise, it was clearly taking a more approachable slant. Something for the kids. But the Weens of 2007 didn't want the Tasmanian devil in shorts and his hot wife that everyone wants to fuck. They want military violence and to kill someone who doesn't come from here. Hoorah! Let's not kid ourselves by saying games were maturing, but the subject matters that people were drawn to were moving. The mascot was on the way out, or at least the kind that you can make a plush or a fursuit of, and that coincided with much of the draw for the genre. It doesn't help that, despite all being pretty good and even distinct from one another, it wasn't hard to amalgamate every title into store-brand Mario Kart, a harsh mark to have if you want your game to push the million sales mark. But some weren't seeing that ambition. Not every game is a vibrant shark, some of them are merely genre leeches, and there were many more leeches than sharks. The exact same mascot mentality was being applied to already established franchises, movies, and kids shows. And I don't want to be so dismissive as to not acknowledge that some of these games were clearly trying. Ben 10 features this slalom mechanic that encourages you to be very active about your turns and maximize the opportunity from them. Though a novel idea and decent execution here and there doesn't mean that many of them were exactly good. While I can see early attempts from established franchises as directionless dabbles into games that might not have had the most experienced or well-balanced staff, it's harder to defend games that got pushed out like this later into time. While all of them are just trying to cash in on a brand, they're also just poorly made in the final product. Sure, that was synonymous with a lot of brand tie-in titles at the time, but that doesn't have to be. And more importantly, if your market of games ends up oversaturated with shoddy titles made purely from the perspective of financial gain, it goes on to impact the view of the genre as a whole. Kokoto Kart would have failed even if it was good. There was no audience trust that would have given it a shot, and for its hubris, the company was banished to the Crazy Frog Racer mines. In a way, you could see everything beyond 2005 as the end of the kart racer gold rush. Genuine competition in the space died out right around the time the Xbox 360 released, and even before that, nothing was able to compete with the monopoly that Nintendo had over everything. Which is fine, because right before everyone stopped caring, they made a Wii game that was great, and I could play it on my PC with my GameCube controller. Mario Kart Wii. This is the creme de la creme. Or at least it is to a lot of people. We can slap back and forth between this and CTR as to which is my favorite, but to qualify its quality, despite Nintendo taking down the servers, you can still find online matches today. I mean, Crash Team Racing never had online, and you can still find online matches for it, but hey-ho. Nintendo has always been on point when it comes to their surface level appeal. There's a little Vaseline if you're looking at it beyond its intended resolution, but the range in palette makes the constant bright and poppy aesthetic still varied. You got your little mans everyone recognizes, and Johnny for some reason. A lot of great stuff for all the family. It's approachable regardless of how experienced you are with these games, so it's no surprise that when it reviewed, people described it as one of the best and most accessible experiences available on the Nintendo Wii. A great game, single or multiplayer, online or off. Fun. Oh, fuck off. Approachable doesn't mean devoid of depth though, not by a long shot. Thanks to bikes and the new for Mario Kart, old hat for other racers, inside drift logic, you had a whole new level of being able to ride each level as tight as possible. Unlike Mario Kart DS, which featured very user-controlled drifting, which is great, Wii instead puts more of its restrictions on how you can access drift. If you're leaning away from your turn, it will take longer to build than if you were drifting inwards. It's easy to see this as a drawback, the player having less control over how they can optimize the game, but I think that's only one way to view it. The new drift system puts less focus on the skill from the dexterity of the player and more so in the precision. Players who have learned how to feel out the timing are rewarded, but there's a greater emphasis on the precision of holding the perfect line. This is still true of Mario Kart DS, don't get me wrong, but it can be obscured under the importance of snaking. In its more accessible elements, Mario Kart Wii rides a fine line between the simple family entertainment that's advertised and the ego-driven hellhole that will have people's entire friend group decided by a video game. From there, you can go on to learn little elements of tech like low tricking, but even if you decide to stop fairly early on in the learning curve, like I did, you still have a fantastic game to bounce around in once a month and go, oh, so entertainment really did peak when I was 11. Even the simple tracks, despite not having as much meat to them as the old man, have this addictive quality thanks to how rock solid the basic mechanics are. As they get more elaborate, they just get better and better, in ways that are intentional like this part of DK Snowboard Cross, and in ways that might not be like this shortcut in Rainbow Road, to the definitely not intentional cuts like this one on Dry Ruins. Ultra shortcuts are, like, they're a bit like wearing Thrasher if you don't skate. Like, yeah, they're cool, but don't get stuck when I ask you if you can spin drift. Neither can I, but that's not important. It's the most immediately nutty thing about this game, but that doesn't mean that it makes it good. It's an interesting novelty in an otherwise tight package. Could have used more levels in the base game, but hey, what can you do? Chaining drifts into wheelies kept the best idea of comboing sequences together without the raw mechanical demands that would allow players to gap each other with one or two techniques. The items might not have been elaborate, but they were all varied and had their own purpose. It might not have been the most intensive the genre ever got, but it was the most refined. As the Wii U and PlayStation 4 hit, the competition died off completely. Mario Kart 7 would come out and prove myself right about Calamari Desert, followed by 8 and 8 Deluxe, and while they would see competition from Sonic All-Stars Racing transformed, it was really a one-man race. Crash Bandicoot was dead, most shovelware was seeing a shift towards mobile where the standards were even lower, Jak is now a franchise that basically only exists as cave murals. The kart racer was a toy that was all used up, the man who started it all still clawing in the cash on his console that desperately needs to be moved on from. It's not exactly a tragedy, it's a gaming trend, but I'm still a little bit mad that we never saw a proper improvement on Crash Team Racing. Nitro Fueled came out and it was great, but also it never released on PC and my Joy-Cons have stick drift and I'm too lazy to fix, so curse of layoffs upon ye. Oh, they already... curse of more layoffs, I guess. Perhaps time is a flat circle and will wrap around to Astro Boost one day, or maybe it'll be a genre that indie devs will have to revitalize themselves. It's happened before, and it'll happen again. In fact, it's kind of already happening. Either way, there's not that much to miss, because what's behind the tire marks of this weird corporate cash grabs are some games that are pretty good, and some games that you'll forget exist the moment this video turns off.